Thanks for tuning in to the Zelos podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. We're going into the archives this week before we bring a brand new guest on next week. I want to go back. It's the NHL playoffs happening right now, and my old hometown boys, the Boston Bruins, are in it. And hopefully they're going to come back from a one-down loss against the Buffalo Sabres. And it reminded me of my conversation with Kevin Neeld of the Boston Bruins. So I thought I'd pull that out because it's been several years. It was like March of 2022 that he came on and was my guest. Hopefully we're going to connect real soon after the season's over. But for right now, I thought you would enjoy our conversation. And if you happen to not sign up for my free webinar, which is actually tomorrow, Tuesday, April 28th, from the toes to the nose, all about how to utilize foot wedges for rehab and return to performance, be sure to go to my website, RockySnyder.com, and register now so you can get the recording even if you can't make it to the live presentation. And now we'll just hear from our sponsors before we get underway. Zelos podcast is sponsored by Kinetic IQ, where intelligence meets motion. Kinetic IQ brings a biomechanics lab into the palm of your hand, letting you measure movement anytime, anywhere, with just an iPad or an iPhone and no wearables required. I've been using Kinetic IQ's markerless motion capture in my own practice, and whether you're screening athletes, analyzing posture and gait mechanics, optimizing performance, or guiding return to play, it helps practitioners like us save time, capture more objective data, and make instant actionable decisions. So to learn more about how Kinetic IQ is shaping the future of intelligent movement, visit them at KineticIQ.com. That's KineticIQ.com. You know, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have Metabolic Elite be one of the sponsors of the Zelos podcast. You know what makes Metabolic Elite different is their commitment to real results. I've seen a lot of supplements and performance enhancement things over the years, but they pair clinical experience with innovation, like Lipitab, their proprietary solid-state liposomal delivery system. It's a chewable format which enhances absorption like nutrients like BPC 157 and synapses. They're delivered more efficiently in the body, supporting recovery, focus, cognitive health. Their formulas go beyond the basics, solving performance health challenges at the system level. Every product is tested for quality, it's backed by research, and trusted by athletes and clinicians alike. So learn more at metabolicelite.co. And you can get 10% off all of Metabolic Elite products by entering the coupon code ZELOS, Z-E-L-O-S. You're tuned in to the Zelos podcast. I'm Rocky Snyder. This week, we have Kevin Neeld on the show as a guest. He's currently the head performance coach for the Boston Bruins, where he oversees all aspects of designing and implementing the team's performance training programs. He works with a whole bunch of athletes outside of being with the Bruins, but primarily focusing on hockey. Hope you enjoy the show. Be sure to subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Rocky_Snyder. Let's get to the conversation. Boston Bruins, that's my go-to, my hometown boys. And we always had this thing growing up in the 70s and the 80s about New England sports. It was like the Celtics were the hot date. And if you could equate it to like going out with somebody, they would never let you down, and they were the hottest thing around. And the Red Sox were like this girl that just seemed like she was going to be better, but actually turned out to be a complete disaster. And then and the Patriots, well, they were always on kind of like they were there, but they were always a disappointment. And the Bruins at that time were like, okay, if I've got nothing else going on, I'm going to give her a call. But nowadays, I mean, with what you've been doing with the Bees and conditioning those guys, they have been contenders for the Cup and winners of the Cup a couple times in the last couple of years, and they're always up there. So your recipe for success obviously is working. So we're going to touch upon UMass Amherst because we both went there. Me for just partying and you for academics, which was just amazing. And we'll talk about a little of the difference there. But I want to know, you've been out here for my West Coast team, which is the Sharks, and I love my Sharks. I love going to the Shark Tank. In fact, I hate to tell my friends back in New England, but my affiliation or my fandom is more in San Jose than it's ever been with the Bruins there. So, but it's nice to have the best of both worlds. So I get to talk to you with the Bees and see my Sharks play. But how did you get started with that? Because you're a Pennsylvania boy. I know you grew up hockey, but what made you kind of jump into the professional ranks?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my career getting started, but my interest in I wouldn't say just strength and conditioning. I would say all of the extra work that goes into helping maximize an athlete's potential really started for me as a youth hockey player. I was kind of the reasonably skilled but too fat and slow to compete at higher levels type player, and I happened to intersect with a coach that really put a high priority on off-ice training. And I was fortunate to have some good teammates that kind of pushed me along, and I really eventually learned to enjoy that process, and it had a significant impact on how I felt and what I was able to do as a player. And I also at that time was helping that coach run power skating clinics and skill development clinics. And right up until I finished actually as an undergrad, I wasn't sure if I would choose the strength and conditioning path or if I would choose the on ice development path. But I knew that I loved the game of hockey, and I knew that I wanted to make a career out of helping players develop to their full potential in whatever way that I could. And one of those two paths, maybe even get into coaching. And for me, Rocky, what ended up happening is I went to UMass Amherst for grad school, and I had, after my first year there, I basically had an opportunity to go back to the University of Delaware, where I went as an undergrad, and to run power skating clinics and on ice skill development clinics all summer with some people that I developed relationships with there. And it would have been a early step going down that path. And late in my first year there, I connected with Eric Cressy, who had a facility in Hudson, Massachusetts. And essentially what ended up happening is I had applied for an internship with Eric. I got it, and I canceled all my plans back at Delaware, stayed and did the strength and conditioning internship at Cressy's facility all summer. And that was really the fork in the road for me, that it's been strength and conditioning ever since. And towards the end of that experience, Eric and I actually went to a seminar together that Mike Potenza was speaking at. And Eric introduced me to Mike. Mike and I connected that way, and he and I became good friends, and still are to this day. And basically my entry into professional sports came because Mike had just created a full-time assistant position in San Jose, and I had transitioned out of, I had been the director of a private facility in South Jersey for 7 years, transitioned out of that, was looking to move into a team setting. The opportunity with San Jose popped up, and it was just a great opportunity to work with a good friend. But maybe even more than that at that stage in my career was to learn from somebody that had been in it for 10 years and had set up a really good system and had a really good training culture, and just, get the full benefit of all the lessons that Mike had learned over his first 10 years in pro sports, in addition to, just his training methods in general. So,
so for the listening audience, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, for the listening audience, Mike Potenza is the head strength conditioning coach for the San Jose Sharks. And actually, I've had him on the show. So if you want to look at previous episodes, look back and you can check out the conversation I had with him. But I mean, working under his wing right there and knowing the type of work that he does over there with the Sharks, I mean, that must have been like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, it was. I think, like I had mentioned, Mike and I had been in touch for 7 or 8 years prior to that. So he and I had chatted quite a bit about what he was doing, what I was doing. So I had a pretty high level of familiarity of his approach. But obviously it's a unique setting. You can have an identical philosophy to somebody else, but if you work in two different settings, the outcome of that philosophy could look totally different. So Mike at that time was in the earlier stages of getting more involved with blood work and testing for food sensitivities and nutrient deficiencies and some things that I think you guys had talked about when he was on the podcast. And
yeah,
I think with my background, I had spent a lot of time looking at different movement assessments and using those to influence programming. And both of us were pretty heavy on trying to find ways to individualize training programs based on the specific needs of the player. So there were a lot of complementary synergies between the two of us and what we were doing separately. So, it was it was a lot of fun working with him and being able to put our heads together to see, how our perspectives can complement one another, but then also, we just talk through everything, put everything on the table. If we want to just create the best program, what do we do? What does that look like? And, how can we start taking steps to move things in that direction? So, I give Mike a lot of credit for being, open-minded and constantly questioning himself and constantly looking for ways to do a better job and to do better by the players and the organization. I think that's something that I learned from Mike early on, and something that sticks with me now is to never be satisfied, to keep evolving.
That's the sign of a great coach too, is don't think you know it all, because the more you learn, the less you know, right? So I'm curious, you brought up some like assessments, movement-based to individualized programs. I would love to geek out on that with you. Like, so what tools, what approaches, and are they different for, I wouldn't imagine they're probably different from positional players like defensemen compared to the front three, or maybe when you're talking about somebody in the goal, you might want to have a little different assessment because of the physical nature that's so different with them. But what kind of tools, what assessments or screens or tools that you're using right now to determine individual programs?
Yeah, there's it's a great question. My interest in movement assessments really stemmed early on from trying to wrap my head around what we could do to help minimize risk of some of the hip injuries that are just taken for granted in hockey. I grew up playing, not nearly as well as the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis now, but those adductor and hip flexor strains are just people just assume that they're coming. And my feeling early on was, maybe that they couldn't be eradicated from the sport, but clearly that there were some things that could be done to help minimize risk or minimize the impact of issues when they did arise. So, that kind of got me started down the movement assessment rabbit hole. And, I cast a fairly wide net in that regard. I've taken the FMS courses. I've taken SFMA, I've taken TPI. I've taken hundreds of hours of PRI courses. We had an Aldoa clinic. I'm a licensed massage therapist myself, so we've done ART. I've done FDM, fascial
okay, that's the
model.
First one. That's one I haven't heard. Okay, FTM. I got them all before that, but there's one I haven't heard.
That was a terrific course. I love the people involved with that too, so I'd look into that if you're so inclined. But all of it was really geared around how can we start to identify major red flags that may predispose somebody to a higher risk of injury, and then what can we do about it? And that for me started a appreciation for the fact that one, there's a huge variation in structural archetypes. So the build of people walking in, there's short femurs, long spines, there's short spines, long femurs. And if you ask both of those people to squat, it's going to look totally different. So that may change your risk reward thinking depending on what the exercise is. Certain things look really natural and fluid for certain people, so you can load those heavier, and certain things don't. So you might want to keep that present as a movement, but maybe not as a primary exercise, for example. So
sure,
it started my appreciation for really recognizing the differences in structure and then also the differences in movement characteristics. And you kind of make assumptions that teenage kids, which was the bulk of what I worked with in the private sector, that they're young, they should move uninhibited, and there's obviously some motor control and some learning elements of how to control their body and move in different patterns, but you wouldn't think that there were any joint restrictions or anything along those lines that would impair somebody from learning how to do an exercise correctly. And what we found through that movement assessment process is that early teenagers had severe limitations in ankle dorsiflexion, for example, or shoulder internal rotation, or shoulder flexion, getting full overhead motion. So, there's, when you start to see that over and over, the next logical conclusion is every exercise isn't a good fit for every athlete that's walking through the door. If somebody doesn't have ankle dorsiflexion, then, requiring them to go through an exercise that is going to require ankle dorsiflexion is probably not a good fit for them at that time. So we would start to make adjustments to the program, even if, we had a group and there was a set program for the group at that time. We would start to say, all right, this guy, lack of ankle dorsiflexion, so we're going to pivot from this exercise to this exercise. These two guys can't get their arm overhead, so we're going to pivot from this exercise to this exercise.
Such as, can you give examples of those exercises?
Yeah, sure. So, we would transition away from squat variations to more deadlift variations with vertical shins or near vertical shins for people with dorsiflexion limitations. People that can't get their arm overhead wouldn't overhead press, and I'd be more cautious with chin-ups and overhead pulling variations as well, but they would do things like landmine presses, or
angular,
more, where if their arms just in front of their ear, just in front of their chin, you can just play with the angle that they're pulling at. And if they can't get their arm all the way overhead and you're asking them to, then they're just going to stop here out in front of their chin, and then they're going to arch back so that they can get their arm vertical, which isn't what we're looking for either. So it's not like they are eventually getting this. They're still stuck in the same spot, and then they're leaning back to get to the point that allows their arm to go vertical overhead. So, those to me seemed at the time like common sense substitutions for, if this is the range of motion they have available, then let's identify if the limitation is structural or functional. So is this something that we can change? And if it is, let's go after that aggressively. But in the meantime, until they regain that motion, let's train around the limitation instead of trying to jam our way through it.
Love it. Love it. So then you're taking a multifaceted approach now with individualizing the programs to find out where the restrictions are. If they are functional, then you're going to get them to either do some type of movement prep, some type of, I don't want to say corrective, but guiding them into a pattern of movement that they are not familiar with to elicit a change in their kinematic sequence, so to speak, right? How their joints move. And do you do that with your training staff, like your strength coaches, your assistants under you? Is that something that the physical therapist comes in and says, oh, I got this, or the athletic trainer? How does that work? Don't necessarily name names on the team, but just take an example of, okay, I've got this guy that has restricted dorsiflexion, and therefore I'm going to avoid the squat right now until we clean that or get that less restricted. How are you going to do that?
Sure. So, early on in the private sector, the only time we really had access to medical professionals is if somebody was really hurt, went to see a physical therapist or a chiropractor, and then was also coming in with us while they were simultaneously rehabbing an injury. So a lot of our approach was strictly exercise-based, or, troubleshooting with soft tissue work, whether I was getting my hands on them or whether it was the more general approach of using foam rollers, lacrosse balls, and that sort of thing. So now we're spoiled. because down the hall, I have a couple physical therapists, I have a couple athletic trainers, we have a massage therapist and chiropractors that come in, several times a week. So now my role in that process has changed quite a bit, where number one responsibility for me is not square peg round hole. It is from an exercise selection standpoint. So let's make sure that guys aren't doing anything that clearly their body is not a good fit for at a specific time. As far as what's done about the actual restriction, we certainly continue to reinforce things from an exercise standpoint. Corrective exercise isn't a bad word to me, like it is for some people, but so whether we're approaching things that way, or if it's hey, this guy was good, now something doesn't feel right, like go down the hall, let's, let somebody, maybe they need a manip on the ankle, maybe they need swelling control, maybe they need some soft tissue work just to open up some motion that's already there. So we have a whole range now of highly skilled professionals and of just options that are available for people to use to troubleshoot different issues. And, I honestly, Rocky, I think that there's countless examples in exercise and in the rehabilitation world where you can take different paths to get to the same endpoint.
Yes.
And, sometimes personnel becomes a bottleneck here too, where, somebody might be on the table getting worked on by somebody else, and somebody else needs work and they can't get on because somebody else is there. So then they have to go see somebody else. So that other person may address a limitation slightly different than another person. But at the end of the day, if the intervention leads to the desired outcome, then it's fine. Whether it's, the personal preference of the athlete. Some people really like to be manipulated. Some people really don't. Some people like deeper manual work. Other people don't respond as well to that. So
sure,
there's some people love to stretch and do some of the self-mobilization work, and some people would rather lay on a table and have somebody do that work for them. So, I think it's now it's a matter of, identify what needs to be improved and then find the right skill set that also fits the preferences of that person when possible, and address it, and then just monitor how it progresses over time.
That makes complete sense. And I'm completely jealous of your entire operation to have so many professionals, top notch in different fields, to all come together in another team-like fashion for the betterment of your team athletes. That is just phenomenal. So you mentioned a little bit about the hips and how that is this kind of recurring issue within the NHL and the players, that it's so prevalent that it has become normalized, where it's just accepted. Like NFL players, they just say, you play hurt. That's just how it is. But I'm just gonna put a little asterisk next to that. I'm not sure if I really agree with that. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of force blunt trauma hitting the boards and hitting other players, whether it's in on a football field or on the ice. But on the ice and off the ice, how are you bulletproofing, if we could use that term, the hips? What kind of loading are you doing? Are you like with Mike Boyle, who was with BU for a while, now he's just North U and Woburn. He's really been standing on somewhat of a soapbox, talking about the fact that he's really getting away from a lot of bilateral loading and much more into unilateral loading for various reasons. I guess what's your approach? How are you bulletproofing the hips, if you are?
Yeah, I think just to comment quickly, bilateral versus unilateral, I was fortunate, I guess, to come across that message at a point in my own career and development where I didn't have 30 years of back squatting under my belt to anchor me to that as the king of all exercises. So, at the time, actually, I was at UMass at grad school, and I was working in an exercise neuroscience lab. That was kind of the concentration of my master's degree. And we learned about that bilateral deficit. concept, as a neural concept, that the input to the muscle is less when both contract at the same time opposed to one over the other. So, you know, when I heard some of the more structural arguments from Mike early on, it was easy for me to recognize the value in taking that approach. So, you know, again, that's another example, I guess, of finding different exercises that fit different people more appropriately. And
Yeah.
the cumulative wear and tear on athletes over time plays a significant role in that too. But to circle back to answer your question, you know, I think that there's a couple different layers to it. You know, step one is just from a baseline standpoint, what is their range of motion around the hip? What does their internal and external rotation look like? What does their hip extension look like? Are there any major red flags in those areas? Hip flexion, what does that look like? And if so, is this a likely femoroacetabular impingement scenario that's structural, or is it a hybrid, which I think it is most of the time, between some structural limitations and functional limitations that are amenable to some sort of intervention to open them up? Or is it 100% a functional limitation that you can get it cleaned up through, you know, manual work, corrective exercise, whatever tools you have available to yourself? So that's step one. I think as part of that, if somebody has a major deficit in hip flexion, for example, then we're going to control their hip flexion depth on every lower body exercise that they do.
So when you're talking about assessing hip flexion, abduction, adduction, internal, external rotation, are you looking at that from an open chain perspective, a closed chain perspective? Are you looking at both? How does this hip behave when the foot's off the ground compared to when it's touching the ground?
Primarily using typical table assessments to see, you know, passively unloaded, how is that hip moving? And, you know, I think I could build convincing arguments for looking at it in a lot of different ways. And to me, if somebody's joint can't go through a range of motion passively without the constraints of minimizing the constraints of gravitational input and active control, then they have no shot when they're upright. You know, I don't know a joint in the world that's going to move better actively than it does passively. You know, there are certainly cases where a joint has range of motion and then the individual's ability to control it is compromised, and that's a separate path to help improve that. But if the joint can't move passively, it can't move actively, is my stance on that. So,
okay.
So we start there. And then there's the, you know, if there are limitations that we think we can address, then we use a wide variety of exercise-based interventions. Some of those are from the FMS, SFMA school of thought. Some of them are from things that I've learned from Andrew Spina and his functional range conditioning seminar. Some of them are PRI techniques that I learned from them. You know, I think one of the big things that steers me in one direction over the other is just getting an appreciation for how one side looks relative to the other. You know, we see quite a bit of you know, somebody might have 10 degrees more of external rotation on one side and 10 degrees more internal rotation on the opposite side. And that's likely a sign that, you know, barring anything wonky from an anti-version, retroversion, unilateral bias there, it's likely a sign that, you know, the axis is out of whack. And if you can use some asymmetrical type exercises to help restore some of that positioning, and then the symmetry reappears, or at least the opportunity for more symmetrical motion appears, then you're okay. And that was the right fix. But so, you know, I'm kind of veering off course a little bit here.
No, that's good, because I'm interested in the asymmetrical training, because with basically the approach that I take with my clients and athletes is that it is not uncommon for us to be more biased on one limb than the other until we gain a little bit more symmetry within them, and then we can start to be less biased. So That's interesting. I'm wondering, with your strength training protocol, are there times where you're going to say, you know what, we're going to do this RDL or this particular directional lunge, and I want you to do more on your right leg than you do on your left leg? Do you tend to do that, or is that kind of not necessarily what you're talking about?
We would very rarely do that from a strength training standpoint. We will do that more with an emphasis and a focus on motor control. So if somebody has a really hard time stabilizing on one leg, then we may cue them in a few different ways and have them do extra reps on that to help really hammer home their ability to control that pattern. And that includes more static type movements like a one leg SLDL, like you just referenced. It also includes more dynamic patterns like landing single leg jumps, or rebounding off of one leg in single leg jump patterns. We'll get, hockey players obviously spend a lot of their time on the ice and move very eloquently on the ice, but sometimes not as well off the ice. So we'll get some pretty funny, a guy can skip really well laterally in one direction, but not the other direction. So we'll certainly spend some more time in some of those areas that fall more under the motor control umbrella in those cases, but not as much unless it's an injury reconditioning standpoint where we know that there's a deficit. Then that's a little bit of a different scenario. But with people that are pain-free and healthy, it's more of a control focus than a strength or hypertrophy focus.
Sure, I got you. So when it comes to your staples, like you've got on your website, you've got quite a few products when it comes to creating a powerful athlete in hockey, and you've got some great, you've got DVDs and a whole series of information workshops and so on that are on there. What have you found over the years you've been doing this and proven true by what you do with the athletes? What are your go-to kind of fundamental moves in a gym setting, like when it comes to strength training as well as explosiveness? What do you put the majority of your athletes through with the understanding that everything is individualized?
Sure. Yeah, I think from a lower body standpoint, we will trap bar deadlift quite a bit. We dumbbell reverse lunge. Dumbbell step up is an exercise that I've done more and more over the years. Not as much early on in my career, but that's one that we use a lot.
And do you tweak it in the frontal or transverse plane just because there's so much more action around the hip?
So primarily in season, we don't. We just, the focus for me more is on getting an aggressive shin angle in a forward lean over that front foot, opposed to a more upright torso and a more vertical shin orientation. We'll try to really cue an aggressive forward lean. We also split squat quite a bit. We don't RFE as much in season, but that's a big staple in the off season. So, I would say unilateral, bilateral, we're probably 70-30 unilateral heavy. That trap bar deadlift is our primary bilateral lower body consistent presence in the program. We have a pit shark here as well to belt squat. So we use that quite a bit too. It's easy to monitor depth. It removes the load from the spine completely because the belt goes around their waist. So it's a way to get some of that bilateral load while minimizing some of the axial loading that can create issues with guys, particularly as they age and prolong their career and have more wear and tear, both from a cumulative total volume of movement standpoint, but then also from a, if you're 35 years old nowadays, you've probably been training for 15 to 20 years, so the training age factors into that quite a bit as well. So those are kind of the big staples from a lower body standpoint. From an upper body standpoint, I think we dumbbell bench, we dumbbell row, do a lot of cable rowing, both angled from a more of kind of an angled pull down, as well as horizontal row patterns. We do a fair amount of cable pressing as well. I think the thing that I have moved more towards over the course of my career as well is just it's very rare particularly in ice hockey, but in most team sports for the two limbs in the upper body to be doing the same job. Typically one is doing something different than the other. So we do way more
oppositional motion.
Alternate arm or single arm upper body strength exercises than I did early on.
And that's how you feed a lot into the core component of connecting or integrating upper body, lower body force together.
Exactly. And then also just encouraging open thoracic motion. So when you have something in both hands, you kind of lock into that extended position and then you just stay there. So you're not getting a lot of freedom of rib cage movement when you go through those patterns. And look, like if you do 3 sets of 6 of a barbell bench press, does that mean you're not going to be able to rotate ever again? Like, no, it's not that severe. But I think the more we can bias exercise to allow the freedom of movement in certain areas, the less we're going to be taking away from that freedom of movement. So, some of it, I think half the battle is just removing the bad, trying to minimize the amount of things that may steer somebody down a bad path is going to set them up for success as much as, trying to find the perfect exercise to, address some, in some cases, an asymptomatic movement limitation that has been discovered through some process. So for us, it's more just, encouraging a little bit of that rotation, making sure that we're not doing things consistently that may eventually steal that freedom over time.
And I'm really curious in terms of like 3-dimensionality, because when you're talking about a hockey player and you're watching them skate, it's not like you're watching a sprinter running around the track. It's not, although there's a lot of sagittal plane, hip flexion extension going on, obviously, but we've got abduction and adduction. We've got a lot more rotation going on. They're crossing over, they're rotating around. So when it comes to creating strength patterns for that, I mean, we're primarily sagittal plane biased in the gym setting, whether it's the lunge, the squat, the split squat, deadlifts, and so on. Do you tweak these? Do you, in terms of like bulletproofing those hips again, are you looking for, this week we're going to explore lateral lunge left and right. We're going to do stepping back behind or crossing in front with the lunges. We might do the same thing on the boxes where we're going to do a lateral stepping lunge or a rotational stepping lunge. Are those part of the program? Are they kind of like accessories that you kind of play around with when you see something happening? What is that like?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's 2 things that I want to touch on. The first is that when you pile on enough mileage, everything breaks eventually, right? So part of our annual vision is specifically getting away from some of those lateral and rotational patterns because the volume of those things in season is so high. So there is an element of let's give these things a break and allow the body to recover, but then also let's restore range of motion, and let's early in the off season, let's focus on the opportunity for clean and diverse movement without hammering volume and intensity across some of the patterns that have been emphasized so heavily over the course of a very long and grueling season. That said, I think that there are a few different ways once we kind of get through that initial phase of the off season that you can start to address some of those factors. And, in a early acceleration on the ice, it is a more sagittal plane dominant pattern, but the force input into the ice is more in a horizontal vector. And it's true, even at higher speed skating, that's more the case than not, that it's not the vertical input that's as impactful on moving the body as the horizontal input into the ice. So we do a lot of sled pushes and resisted sled drags, both forward and laterally over the course of the off season with different players. So
on ice or off ice?
Off the ice. The ice. So one of our main, in certain phases of our off season program, heavy sled marching is one of our main lower body strength exercises. We will also do some different lateral lunge dumbbell patterns that start to build some push strength in more of a lateral pattern. But from a strength standpoint, we take a more general approach where we're just trying to build the size of the engine. And then a lot of our movement work, our speed work, and our power work is driven more into those lateral and rotational patterns throughout the course of the off season. So we'll do more lateral jumping, more rotational jumping, med ball throws, things along those lines, even playing with different starting sprint positions and different transitional sprint patterns. So, you know, crossover steps, starting from a side standing position and really emphasizing leaning over the front leg and pushing under with that front leg like they may in a crossover stride. Those things, I think once we try to, when the focus turns more into maximizing speed and power output, I think some of the things that you're questioning from a lateral and rotational pattern really become a more a predominant focus in those stages of the off-season program. In season, part of our process is on a daily basis, we have a warm-up in place. And what that warm-up entails will be different depending on the situation. Are we training that day? Are we not? What have we done the day before? What do they have coming up the next couple of days? But the general elements of that are some sort of mobility work, some sort of hip and core, you know, lower load, motor control, activation type exercises, and then more of a locomotion based dynamic warm-up. So those are kind of the three main pillars. So a lot of our, so on a daily basis, we're emphasizing hip mobility in different planes of motion. So, you know, we will try to rotate through different exercises that target the same area, but in slightly novel ways, so that players are taking those joints and that tissue through ranges in different ways, but on a consistent basis, so that you're not just kind of stretching the same tissue in the same way on a daily basis. Similarly, from a hip and core activation exercise standpoint, we're trying to attack different patterns of motion. You know, I view hip exercises as, you know, anterior hip, medial hip, lateral hip, posterior hip, and then making sure that we're addressing all of those things consistently, but not hammering them in the exact same way on a regular basis. Same thing with the core. You know, we have, you know, kind of an anterior core, a lateral core, diagonal core patterns, and then straight rotational core patterns. So all of those things are present in our program on a consistent basis, but again, rotating through all of those stresses. And then the locomotion element of our warm-up process also will emphasize some of those lateral and rotational patterns, but again, at fairly low volumes and at controlled intensities, with a focus more on rhythm and coordination than on maximum output, which they should be targeting daily on the ice.
It makes complete sense. So the people that have listened to these podcasts will understand that it's not that I have a foot fetish so much as I am intrigued by the structure of the foot and how all those 33 joints, 26 bones move in opposition in some ways, and to either become this mobile adapter and absorb impact and absorb the surface in which it strikes upon. And then in a moment's notice, in less than a second, it becomes this rigid lever that creates propulsion. And with a hockey player, though, they're laced up in these skates, and there doesn't seem to be too much freedom of movement. Plus, they are on the thinnest base of support, I think, of any athlete that we can think of, on that single blade. And I say this because I'm curious, Kevin, when you're going through like SFMA or your movement assessments and so on, how much time do you go down and look at ankle inversion, eversion? You already mentioned dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, but how deep do you go into the structure of the foot? Just like you said, one person will have a long spine, short femur, and then a long femur, short spine. You're going to have a lot of different foot shapes. Is that something that you've started kind of delve into or explore?
So I think is a global screening process for the organization. We're really trying to capture major big picture red flags. And, significant limitations in hip rotation in our sport is a major big picture red flag. Significant limitations in dorsiflexion range of motion is going to limit somebody's opportunity to adopt deeper skating positions, which is a significant red flag and important for us to know off the ice from an exercise programming standpoint. Some of those more granular details about how the foot and ankle move, I think for certain people can be incredibly important. And that's a rabbit hole that I think we would go down on a case-by-case basis with our medical staff. And, I can tell you, I've seen players with extremely high arches that have a hard time controlling movement over that foot. They tend to roll towards the outside, and then once they're going, they're going. So, seeing them move barefoot sometimes is really helpful because you can see what the foot's doing and start to appreciate, is this a foot losing control that's then feeding up the chain, or is this maybe a centering and hip control issue that's feeding down the chain into the foot? I've also seen the far opposite extreme where, somebody's navicular bone is just sitting on the turf when they walk around, and there's no arch and there's no ability to create that rigid segment that you alluded to earlier. And as you know, that can create its own issues, both from a stability and control standpoint, but also from a force transfer standpoint, because they are locked in the boot, but that doesn't mean the foot doesn't move.
True.
If you throw ice skates on or even ski boots and you shift your weight side to side, you're going to feel your feet inverting and everting, and pronating and supinating even within that boot. So, I think that it's an area that can have a big input up the chain if there's something that's not operating the way that it should be. But I also think that there are so many different, like you could probably build similar arguments about the hands, where somebody's hand
Sure.
moving in a certain way that's not feeding into the shoulder the right way and vice versa. And,
All
for us,
connected.
it's more, what's the net that we can cast that's going to have the most significant impact on the group as a whole. And then from there, again, we're fortunate to have some people with some unique and advanced skill sets to dive deeper on certain individuals if they need it. But, we get guys that'll block shots and then have swelling go down to the ankle. And then that changes the way that they're able to load through that joint for some period of time. We've had some bad ankle sprains, high ankle sprains, things like that have lingering effects down the road. So I can certainly appreciate the impact that some limitations in those areas will have up the chains. You might watch somebody squat, and even if you're not tapping into maximum dorsiflexion range of motion, if there's some sort of old lingering ankle issue, they may shift weight or rotate weight off of that foot. And if you don't look at it from the right angle, you might miss it. If you look at it from the side, it might look like their torso angle, their, quote unquote neutral spine, and, their hip depth is good and everything looks pretty solid from that vantage point. But, then if you're looking at their knees straight away, you see the ones kind of pulling back behind the other. And if you look at them from behind, you'll start to see there's a little bit of a twist through the hips there. So, we've seen our fair share there.
I bet.
But, maybe that speaks to the importance of just constantly changing your vantage point in the way you're watching people move. Because if you watch from one angle, you might miss it.
Yeah, no, well said. So aside from your voice in regards to coaching and your eyes and what you see, and of course your hands with the fact that you've done all this other work and you can do soft tissue work with them, I'm thinking more about the tools outside of your body, in your toolbox of conditioning. What are your go-to tools when it comes to strength conditioning your athletes? Are there certain devices that you are preferring more so than others? What are your top 3 or 4 items that you would have if somebody said, okay, we're going to set you up here, I want you to train these hockey athletes, and just tell me you can only have 4 things? What are they?
Yeah, I think budget would dictate that to a large extent, but I think we have a gym aware system here. So we have several gym aware units to measure the velocity and the power output with certain exercises. I think that does a couple things for us. One, it allows us to track output at different loads across the force velocity continuum at different times. So if we're emphasizing more low load, high velocity work, or more high load, lower velocity work, we can still gauge change and improvement across the force velocity curve at different times of the year. So that's really beneficial from kind of a program effectiveness and monitoring standpoint. There's also an element of just tapping into the competitiveness and maximizing effort. I think when people are getting instantaneous feedback, it gives them something to anchor to and something to, score to try to beat, whether it's theirs or the guy standing next to them, or both in most cases. So that's a big one for us. We've had opportunities to use dual force plates, and I've had access to a just jump mat for years. I think similar thought process, having some way to provide feedback on jump height, but as a longitudinal monitoring tool, but also as a way to, if you're going to jump, now getting the feedback says, did I jump higher or not than last time? And what did I change about my technique or my intent that allowed me to maximize that output? So there's some utility there as well. I think from an off-ice training standpoint too, having a heart rate monitoring system can be really helpful, both in terms of improving the specificity of your conditioning recommendations, and also in just raising awareness about how recovered people are between exercises that have a different focus, meaning, your heart rate should recover before your nervous system recovers. If you're doing a maximum effort lift or a maximum intensity sprint or jump, something where the intent is to really raise the ceiling from an intensity standpoint, your nervous system's not going to recover as fast as your heart rate. So if you finish a set and then you're just going right to the next thing, if your heart rate's still elevated, then that's a clear early signal that your nervous system isn't going to be at a point that's going to allow you to maximize your intensity again on the next set. And if that's the focus of that exercise or of that training phase, then wearing heart rate monitors throughout an entire session gives some objective data point, because it's harder to say, sit for 12 minutes because that's what research says, or, well, how do you feel? Do you feel good? Go. Because a lot of times people will, out of boredom, say that they feel recovered when they're not. So I think having
takes the guesswork away.
Anchor to, some of it at least. I think, half the battle I'm learning is as I continue on here in the industry is just being less wrong. It's not about, it's not always about having the perfect program. It's about just steering the ship in the right direction. Make sure that if you're racing to a finish line, that you're pointed in the right direction to start. So there's still a lot of unpredictability in the way that the human body works, the way it evolves on a day-to-day basis. So I think having some objectivity through that process to help kind of guide you in some of the decision making is really helpful. So those would be three big ones from a technology standpoint.
Right on. Well, I've really thoroughly enjoyed the presentations you've given through the NSCA over the course of this last couple of years. Most recently, there was just a presentation you gave that they put on their website that I thoroughly enjoyed. But learning things as you do, and then imparting that knowledge down into the strength and conditioning industry is really wonderful. I'm curious though, what is it you're pursuing now in regards to knowledge? Where are your sights? Where has your compass pointed to? What are you intrigued and interested in?
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of what I would probably describe as professional ADD, that, different things catch, I'm interested in everything. And different things catch my interest at different times, and I'll chase those for a little bit and then realize that something else that's really important probably isn't getting the attention that it deserves, and I'll pivot and try to circle back to some of that. So, you know, I think where I, for the last several years, have gone pretty deep down the workload monitoring rabbit hole, and more of a longitudinal monitoring, and, you know, what is this information telling us? What is it not telling us? What are some of the challenges in answering certain questions about what guys are doing on the ice in particular, and how you can use that to create interventions, maybe to fill some gaps, because a lot of that information comes from sports that only compete once a week, where our scenario is obviously drastically different from that. So,
Yeah.
you know, as an example, if in a soccer game, if somebody doesn't get enough high-speed running, then they could do it immediately after the game and say, you know, we now have another week before we need to compete again. Or, you know, maybe they could build that into the week of practice on a specific day, knowing that they still have a window to allow that player to recover before the next competition. Well, for us, you have to be really strategic in how you do that, because we're going to play a game again in 48 hours. So if you say, all right, the next day we didn't do enough of this, or, you know, the cumulative volume of work for this player is drifting down for whatever reason, so we're going to start to add more to build them back up. Well, all the work that you do, there's a recovery window associated with that. And for us, we compete in that recovery window every time. So, you know, that has been where a lot of my continuing education focus and energy has been in the last several years. And I think now I'm looking more at how I can improve as a communicator, and how I can improve as a leader, both, you know, within our performance department in the organization, but also as part of the organization as a whole. How can we better collaborate across different departments, and, you know, what role can I play in being better from my perspective as an individual in the head performance coach role, but then also, are there opportunities for me to facilitate better communication and collaboration across different departments in the organization? So that's where some of my attention is going to recently.
Right on. Well, I'm just can't thank you enough for sharing everything you've shared today, and I'm excited for the rest of the season. You guys are right now in the standings. You're fourth in the Atlantic, and moving your way up above the Maple Leafs, hopefully soon enough, and get the hell out of the Lightning's way as they start falling down, hopefully, because Lightning always descends down more often than not, right? So we're going to hope for that. And the Panthers, well, just swat them out of the way. We want to see you guys back in the cup. And I'm going to put a whole bunch of contact information at the end of this episode, such as kevinneeld.com. So any hockey strength conditioning coaches out there, or hockey athletes who want to improve their power and speed on the ice, they can go to your site and get a whole bunch more information. And what about Instagram? Can we follow you on Instagram?
Yeah, it's just I'm pretty easy to find. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I'm just Kevin Neeld on all of those. So
perfect.
It should be pretty easy to find there. I've tried over the last couple months to start to. I don't have as much time as I used to write longer articles and to publish information on my website as consistently as I'd like. So I've started to try to use Instagram as a platform to just share small tidbits of information. So certainly I do that for me as much as everybody else, but if there are things that, you know, I encourage people to check it out. If there are things that they like, things they don't like, if there are things that they would like maybe me to weigh in on, or me to comment on, or whatever questions, just reach out to me through there, and then I'll do my best to take in the feedback and use that moving forward.
Fantastic. Kevin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that brings this episode of the Zelos podcast to a close. I just want to thank Kevin Neeld and the Boston Bruins for allowing him to come on the show and speak about a whole bunch of things, from conditioning to assessments and a whole lot more. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next week.